It's my very great pleasure to welcome Gemma Milne to the stage. So Gemma is a writer, a researcher who focuses on narratives surrounding activism in and political economy of science and technology. She is author of Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And if you didn't already pick up a copy out there, you're too late, it's already gone. She's currently a PhD researcher in science and technology studies and sociology at Edinburgh University, and you might have seen some of her work in The Guardian, the BBC and other places, or the Radical Science podcast. A very warm welcome, Gemma Milne.
Thanks so much for the invite here. It was really fascinating, even just listening to the Q&A. There are a lot of themes already coming up that hopefully I'll touch on a little bit in my talk, and then hopefully we can dive into a little bit more in the Q&A and the panel after. I'll probably only talk for 15 minutes because I appreciate you've all stuck by us and gone straight into the keynote. And I always think with these things it's better to kind of hear what it is that you want to know about as opposed to just hearing from me. Thank you for the intro, David. That saves me a bit of time to not have to introduce myself. So I was having a little look around the BSI resources and having a little think about what to talk about. I was invited to talk about digitalization, which is a huge topic with many, many different kinds of themes, many different tensions, many different areas of interest. But I was inspired by the Inspiring Trust for a More Resilient World purpose, I think it is, on the BSI website. And particularly this concept of trust is something that we talk about a lot in the technology world, and I can imagine across all areas of standards, trust is a really key topic. So what I thought I would do is just take you through three kind of, I guess, I don't want to call them top tips, but things that I think that are really important, that need done, that need thought about when thinking about trust with respect to digital technology specifically, and hopefully we can open up a bit of discussion about what it means for the future of tech and for science. So the first one that is so crucial when it comes to trust is this idea of making technology understandable. You've probably heard of the term black boxes before when hearing particularly about AI, but technology in general. And normally this is a reference to artificial intelligence products that give decisions and we don't really know how they come up with the answers because of the nature of the way the technology is built. That is a true problem when it comes to AI development. We ask for things like explainable AI and so on and so forth. But I think there's more to this term black boxes when we're thinking about trust in technology, three areas of which that we really need to focus on if we want to be truly understandable, not just from a technology perspective. So the first one, of course, is make technology understandable. Be much more transparent with code, be much more transparent about data that's gone into systems that allows to come up with answers. But black boxes are also true of organizations that build things. Companies often don't share their processes, their data, the people's names that worked on things. So companies themselves or organizations can be black boxes in and of themselves. And sometimes that's the challenge when it comes to understanding technology. It's not the code not being able to be understood, but what's being shared in the main, either with regulators, with the public, with media outlets, and so on and so forth. So companies are sort of the second part of that black box. And the third one is education. If you can't engage in the world of technology, if you feel, I studied maths at university, and whenever I tell anyone, you either get one of two responses. The first one is, yay, a fellow maths nerd, and the other response is, ugh, maths, ugh, I have no idea what you're talking about. And this kind of visceral reaction to science and tech happens quite a lot, and that worries me. Because being able to engage with science and technology isn't just this kind of thing that we should do on the side. It's crucial in terms of how we think about what we want our science and tech to do. So this understandable point, three areas. We need to make the tech understandable from a code perspective. We need to make ways of organizations to be able to share what's happening on the inside. The concept of trade secrets needs to be really nudged at a little bit more to work out whether or not we're actually happy with that. And we need to be able to explain things much better. So for this, let us see under the hood. particularly when it comes to AI systems, we need to know how decisions are made. We were talking just now about health AI apps. It's a perfect example. If you go on and, I don't know if you've ever used one of these chat bots that help diagnose you, and you almost always get told you have cancer. It would be nice to know how it came to that. What was it that you said that suggested that you probably have cancer? Obviously very problematic in many different ways. Let it be accessible, and I'm going to talk a little about usability in a minute, but here I mean accessibility from the perspective of allowing people in to make decisions. This I always think about this through an analogy with music. Who here plays one musical instrument? Who here plays two musical instruments? Three? 4? Okay, who here plays 0 musical instruments? Okay, who here has an opinion on the latest Beyonce album? Right? Oh, come on, more of you, for goodness sake. Your opinion can be, I don't even know why there's so much hype. The point being is you don't need to be an expert in playing 3 or 4 or however many musical instruments in order to have opinions and engage in the world of music. The same should be for science and tech. You don't need to be able to understand the intricacies of code to have an opinion on whether or not you want AI systems to be used in our healthcare, right? So we need to make technologies far more accessible, understandable, and therefore engageable, if that's a word. And this third point is around declaration. It's something I'm kind of working on a little bit in my research, which I think that we need to kind of start being a bit more obvious about why we're using science and tech. There's a sort of elephant in the room a lot of the time around when technologies are adopted. And I think AI technology is a perfect example in workspaces. You know, we talk a lot about, oh, it's going to make things easier for employees and it's going to make the world more open and so on and so forth. And it's like, no, the reality is it's saving money. This is what this is doing. It's resource management. And I think we need to be much more declarative about why we're adopting technologies in the system that we live in. Because it muddies the waters in terms of people not really understanding what's happening or why it's being used and therefore how the systems work. So I think being much more declarative about technology adoption, whether you're a business explaining it to your employees, a government agency explaining it to your workers, or anybody explaining it to the public. Let's just be a bit more obvious. Everyone knows anyway. So let's be much more declarative about our technology. Okay, the second point is this idea of making it for everyone. I've already used the word accessible, so I've changed it to usable. But I'm sure you all know what I mean when I'm talking about accessibility, particularly from taking a lot of the CRIP perspectives in when we're thinking about technology. There's tons and tons of great work out there talking about a variety of disabilities and the impacts they have on technologies. I've left my phone over there on my seat, but I was going to hold it up and show you the screen. Can you imagine, say for instance, you're holding a cup of coffee, like, just by holding the cup of coffee, you probably know how hot it is. You probably know how heavy, roughly how much coffee's in it. Just you could shut your eyes. And you could also drink from it without looking at it, all these sorts of things. You can't engage with a mobile phone just by holding it because it's just a piece of metal in front of you. There's no way to engage with it fully, not well, for everyone who has various different abilities. So usability is really key. We need to think a bit more deeply about what it means for a piece of technology to be usable, whether it's digital, a physical device, or more. It also needs to be monetarily accessible. Things need to be cheaper. We need way more global perspectives in terms of technology, and we need education to be better. I was speaking to someone recently from a large car company, which was it secret? I don't know, whatever. A large car company. And they were talking about digitizing their factory floor. And they said, I bet you're expecting us to say that our older generation of workers who've been working in our factories for ages are really struggling to adapt to our digitalization efforts. No, they're not. We're actually not having any issues. The problem we're having is with young people, because they're coming in, young people as in below age of 20, sort of 18, 21-year-old. They're saying they don't know how to use a mouse, they don't know how to use a keyboard because they're used to growing up with iPads and phones. And all of our factory systems use desktop computers with a phone, mouse and a keyboard attached to it to control the huge piece of factory hardware that they have. And I was completely shocked by that. As someone who works in science tech, I thought young people don't know how to use a mouse or a keyboard. And I thought, yeah, why would you know how to use a mouse and a keyboard if you've been in a school that hasn't necessarily had good IT education and you've maybe only grown up using your mum and dad's phone, or maybe you've not had a phone in your house. So we have to think a little bit more broadly about what making technology usable actually means, and who's been included when we start changing over to different kinds of devices and ideas. Let technology be a common good. I really firmly believe that we need to take a much more commons approach to how we think about technology, thinking about it as like water, something that we're able to access, not just the internet, but technologies themselves. We need to have a lot more interoperability, which I'm sure is something that I don't need to talk to standards professionals about, but we need to make sure that technologies are not just these siloed things that only few people can access, few people can control, and few people can afford. And we also need to make it more democratic. I don't know if you guys saw last night on Twitter, Elon Musk co-hosted the announcement that Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, is run for president. And it broke, which was hilarious. If you haven't seen the news, the Twitter system didn't work at all. But there's something interesting there about this. Twitter was already owned by a company and decisions were made by exec teams and so on and so forth. It wasn't democratic. But the idea that someone can kind of just swoop in, buy a system and start deciding that Republican presidential candidates can announce their presidency on the platform and no one else can is highly concerning to me, and not just because I love Twitter. So I think that we need to keep having conversations and discussions about what democracy really means when it comes to technology and thinking about technologies we're using. How democratic are they? Who are making decisions around who gets to buy this, who gets to make decisions, who gets to use it? And my final point is around making technology far more human. We need to solve problems. We can't start from technology. We can't be like, AI is really cool, let's work out how to use it. We need to start from the perspective of what are the actual issues that we have in our organization, in the public, in our companies, and then use experts, either internally or externally, to work out if maybe there might be a match with this technology. We mustn't start with the technology. A good example I tend to bring up, this kind of problem-first thinking, is in the anti-aging science space. You'll speak to the so-called transhumanists and they say we want to extend life by 20 years. That's what we want to do. We want to get to everyone being able to live over 100 years because, for us, the average age of death is around 80, right? That's the human average age of death. And you go, all right, okay, so you're investing millions, if not billions, into science and technologies to try and extend the age by 20 years. What about if you go to an area in America or the UK or so-called developed countries where the average age of death is 40 or 50. I live in Glasgow. There's many areas in Glasgow that the average age of death is 50. And I can tell you some anti-aging drug is not the thing that's going to extend life by 20 years. I think that we need to really think about what's the problem and what's the reality around why there is a problem. And you only have to go into these areas of Glasgow and go, I've got a tech solution, you'll get laughed out. So we need to be a lot more deliberate about this idea of problem-first thinking as opposed to tech solution first. We need to think about feeling. We need to focus on feeling. I already gave you this hand example of holding a cup of coffee and touching your phone. But I don't think we really design for how our bodies actually work and how we feel and how our emotions work. We design a lot more sort of tech file system first. So it would be great if we could kind of be starting to thinking much more about our bodily existence. But the other area of feeling much more in our head, and this is related to my, you mentioned my book earlier, thank you, David. Sorry for anyone who didn't get a copy, you can get it at all good bookshops. But a lot of it, my book is all about hype, if you didn't already know, and about hyped up narratives and how technology headlines kind of catch on. And one of the things I kind of touch on is this. The reason that hype exists is not necessarily because a tech is good or bad, but it's because it makes people feel something. And it tells us a lot about the reality that we're all living in, the fact that there's hype around something. The fact there's hype around crypto is reflective of the fact that a lot of people feel a lack of control. A lot of people feel skint, that they don't have any money. They're looking for other ways to try and make this system that they live in, that they don't feel they have any control of, work. The same with the AI is going to steal our jobs narratives. They catch on because they're fear-inducing. People feel like they're going to become irrelevant. People are worried about losing their jobs. People are worried about not paying their bills, especially at the moment. So it's important that we focus on feeling when we see reactions to technology and science. It tells us a lot more about the people than about the tech, and that's what we should be looking at to go back to the solving problem point. And my final point is this idea of avoiding the other. So I mentioned that AI is going to steal our jobs. Example, this is a kind of standard example of this othering of technology. It's the AI that's going to steal our jobs. It's the robots that are going to steal our jobs. No. The headline should be corporate executives are making active decisions to replace human labour with digitalisation in the name of profit. And it's not an other, it's a human. It's not something separate. We need to be really key about not seeing technology as something else. We also need to be key about not seeing technology and science as something on the side. I hate that newspapers have a tech and science section. We live in a digital and tech and science enabled world. That's our era. It's a part of, I would say, almost every area of our lives. The toilet is a technology, you know. So I think we need to stop othering digitalization, science and tech as a thing that other people do. The tech team does, the innovation team does, the IT team does. And that goes just not in organizations, but in terms of making decisions at political levels, at public levels, at organizational levels and international. It's for all. So those are kind of my key thoughts on what it means to have a bit more trust in tech. A little bit high level, but hopefully it's spurred a couple of thoughts in some of you, and hopefully we can go on and discuss it a little bit in the Q&A and the wonderful panel. Thank you very much.
Gemma, brilliant. Thank you for that so much. There's so many things that really resonate there. Some of the issues around science and tech. It's often when we talk about standards, and everybody in the room is connected to standards, and when you go out and talk to people about standards, they immediately say, well, I'm no expert on standards, even though they entirely know how standards are used, but there's an assumption that the rest of us have read every single standard, right, and know every clause, which is never the case. I'm interested in this issue about trust and about people not being honest about tech. Is there an issue? Is this solved, or one of the ways we solve it is by getting a broader range of people involved in tech development?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Not just from a people with different expertise perspective, you know, getting a lawyer in the room, getting a social science in the room, but also from a citizenship perspective. And also the lady from Bloody Good Period talks about it really well as well, this an intersectional approach, being much more progressive about how we think about who should be making decisions and who is impacted in different ways with science and tech. It's the only answer. And to be frank, people who work in science and tech, most of them will tell you they are very expert on their area of science and tech, but they're not going to be experts on other things like how it's regulated or how it impacts different communities and stuff. So they need that input and they want that input. I think a lot of it is bringing down those barriers and making it much more comfortable. As I say, that the whole, maths, that's a real feeling, that's a real thing that people experience, and we need to be much better at accepting that and working on it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the panellists to come and join us on the stage, if they will. Come and take a seat, and then we're going to get on with the panel in a second. But before we do that, Gemma, I'm interested in what the responsibility is of the companies who are using tech as an excuse. We heard about BT recently. We're laying off loads of people and replacing it with AI. Yeah. And they're kind of using tech as a way of excusing their own behaviour, right?
Yeah, this is a really common thing you see with tech narratives, this idea of like tech will save us, and that tech is this kind of separate thing, that sort of morals are embedded in the use of tech and innovation. I mean, BT were pretty heavily criticised. I think people are kind of waking up to this idea that technology is not this neutral thing in the same way that laws are not, or standards are not. You know, a company saying, we're going to lay off everybody because we found this magic money pot. It's the same sort of thing. Like, you can still criticize it and say, well, that's not appropriate, or that's not right, or that's, you know, it's impacting people in X, Y, and Z way. So I think I'm encouraged by the fact that I think people are a lot more critical now of these kind of narratives, and I'm not sure companies that rely on that are going to win out, frankly. They lose trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gemma Milne, everyone. Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you.
Have a seat. Let's move this chair around a little. Let's move this chair around. Right. Well, welcome to our panel. Boy, do I feel old. We might need some more glasses, by the way, as well. This could get, we could get dry in the mouth here. Kennedy, let's start with you. So Kennedy Mbaver is a postdoctoral research associate at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. You've met him already on the Net Zero Guidelines. Great to welcome back, Kennedy. It's good to see you. Amazing work that's going on with the guidelines. tell us a little bit about the positive effects of digital tools in particular as a way of removing barriers or accelerating climate action, please.
I think thank you, David, and thank you everyone for sort of very interesting sessions today. And thank you, Gemma, for really stimulating our thinking. I'll start with a caveat. I'm always a guest in the standards community, so I'm more at home in public policy. But I'll try to connect my answer to that. In terms of thinking of the digital world and climate action, that's quite an interesting connection, but I'd add another dimension of it, which is demographic. Because if we look at, for example, where the climate impacts are the hardest, or hit hardest, it's around 70 or 80% of the global population, who are quite vulnerable. But there's also a lot of opportunity there for innovative climate action. But what is quite interesting is the kind of demographic sort of shifts that we have. For example, if I pick an area like Africa, 70% of the population is below 30. There's a very rapid adoption of technologies, but if we think about climate action, that's the demography that will be driving climate action, where there's very high growth, but also it's one of the regions that's quite vulnerable. One can see similar kinds of demographic changes in various other places. So I think what could be quite interesting, and I don't have an answer to, is seeing the connection between this rapid development in technologies, between sort of the demographic changes and the ability, as you've articulated so well, of these young people, for example, having the capability to harness some of these tools, which are quite creative and try to address the problem. I don't have the answer as of yet, but that's the way I'd sort of think about it.
Yeah, we talked a lot. Obviously, this whole event is really partly aimed at a younger audience, but we never really talked about demography as a driver of change in that same way. Sophie Pender, we met earlier from the 93% Club. Again, welcome and thank you for partnering with us on this conference. It's great to have you here. Now, your organisation highlights the inequality amongst young people around accessing certain societal privileges, career support. You founded 93% Club. Tell us what are you most proud of in terms of what you've managed to achieve so far?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for having me here today. This is the first kind of event that the 93% Club has been to, which is, we say, feels very adult. We are used to being around lots of Gen Z, and my team often remind me that I am not Gen Z and actually a young millennial, but like an old millennial. So I feel like I'm in good company. Although was that rude? Anyway, so just a bit of context on the 93% Club. So it all started in 2014 when I went to the University of Bristol. And sorry to go off piece, but I've just realised that we went to university together and we did the same course, Emily, and it was the pits, wasn't it? I was...
All the views mentioned today are the panellists' own views.
No, it's a brilliant university now. We're actually working very closely with them so they don't sue me. But I was the first in my family to go to university. I grew up on a council estate in North London. My dad was an alcoholic and a drug addict, and I lost him very young. And so at the age of 16, I had to mature very quickly. I had 2 part-time jobs at McDonald's and John Lewis while studying my A-levels. And I became the first person in my school ever to achieve straight A stars in a school that got 32% at GCSE C or above. Wow. And so I went to the University of Bristol and I was like, I have absolutely made it. And I'm going to build this amazing life for myself and, this working class girl from the community. And it was this sort of American dream narrative that I had believed in. And then when I went to the University of Bristol to study English with Emily, I realised that what I was walking into was an institution that had already been set up for a certain group of people, and it had been like that way for a long time. And so for a while, I spent a long time trying to change things about myself to fit in, and then what I realised is actually I needed to try and find my people. And so I set up a small Facebook group called the 93% Club, which was to find state-educated people at the University of Bristol. And the thing that I'm most proud of is that when I first set up this group, it was in 2016 by this point, so it took me a while to get there. It was an absolute mess at the University of Bristol. People called me an anarchist. I'm a lawyer by profession, so I work at a law firm called Bates Wells, so I'm definitely not an anarchist, but people were so horrified by the idea of calling out educational inequality and class inequality, which was so bizarre in a university like Bristol, which is at the forefront of everything, pulling down statues, marching for women on the streets, but the minute you mention class, it was a completely different story. And so the first Freshers' stand that I had was basically like a heckling fest where people harassed me constantly. And so actually the thing that I am most proud of is the fact that we have moved to a situation today where the 93% Club can be, sponsoring and partnering an event like this, and actually we're outside having really meaningful conversations with people who may not know what the 93% Club is, but actually really care and are really interested. And so I think seeing that journey from complete ignorance to curiosity and acceptance is really meaningful and beautiful to me. So that's what I'm most proud of.
Thank you very much for saying that. Thanks, Sophie. Nikita Bango is Head of Digital Standards Policy at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. We might just have a think about the ways that digital standards policies can mitigate some of the risks associated with some of the technologies we were talking about. We were talking about one of the issues about deployment is trust. What role can you play from government to support that?
Sure, thanks.
Should be on. Are you not mic'd up? Okay.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's great. Digital technology. But thanks for that, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So as David mentioned, I work in the UK government in the newly formed Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and I was really pleased that the science and technology terminology really fits well with all the great stuff that's happening there. So Gemma, I'm sure you were pleased by that new announcement. So I work on digital standards in our department, and I would say that digital standards has become a relatively, it's existed for a while, but the significance of it has increased significantly only in recent years, even in government. I think standards, particularly in the digital tech space, was often seen as the silent or ignored kind of tool to help us achieve the aims we really want to achieve in technology. And I think, UK government, as well as kind of other stakeholders, have recognised the increased importance in standards, particularly as we see the new development of technology just being developed at kind of significant rates. I was tuning into the OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT, discussion with US Congress, where they were actually asking the US government to regulate us. And what sector does that? We've never had that approach come to us before, but I guess it shows kind of the scary nature and the risk that technology can pose in this way as well. So, as UK government, this is where we really see a key role for standards to come and play in, where standards can provide that level of trust, that level of assurance to people, to consumers, to businesses, whilst also balancing that need to allow that space for innovation. We as government don't want to come in and start regulating something which is still developing. I don't think that would be the right approach, whereas standards can often be that complement or even an alternative to that traditional regulatory approach as well. I think one of the benefits of standards, and something that UK government wants to promote as well, is that, and the way standards has done is a really different approach for government policy, one could argue. It's sort of done, I guess, bottom up, whereas, in other sectors, government would normally set the legislation and then companies follow, whereas standards is we're encouraging businesses, people from all different backgrounds to go to these these standards development organizations, bring their expertise, create these standards which are useful, which are relevant, and, safe, and the people who know what they're doing are the ones bringing their minds and thoughts into the standards development as well. So, in that respect, that it is a bit of a strange way for government to kind of do policy, where we're saying, okay, we're encouraging our stakeholders to go out there. We want to increase participation. We want to hear from views from all society as well. So I think in that way, standards, we see standards, UK government, as quite a key tool to help stop those risks and threats we see in that emerging technology space, while also allowing for that space for innovation that's definitely needed in tech policy.
Thanks. Well, lots of you are involved, I know, in tech and digital standards, and I can say with some certainty that we have a friend in government in DCIT and in Nikita in particular, and that's really helpful. to get ahead of the crowd, if you want to put your hand up now, our friends with the microphones will rush to you and you'll be first in the queue to ask your questions, so get ready. I'm going to jump to Zain next, if I may, because we were talking about AI and tech and issues like that. Now, Zain Ahmed is the National Strategy Director at the MedTech Foundation. I think it's fair to say a medical student as well, and you can tell us more about that. So where do you see the opportunities around AI? We talked about AI in healthcare earlier on, but where are the opportunities and how can standards support the safe deployment of AI in healthcare?
Thank you for the question, David, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I'm a student. I lead the MedTech Foundation, which promotes closer ties between engineering, business, and the medical field. And I'm also doing some research into technology regulation within healthcare, so mainly within cancer. So I think I'm well placed to answer the question. And I've worked.
You're not at Bristol University, though, right?
No, Exeter. It's what worse or better. Not their views. And I've also worked at an AI imaging startup. So I think the biggest areas for development in AI are obviously imaging and diagnostics. And I think that's really well known. So, for example, there's algorithms out there that can pick up lung cancer with 90% accuracy, or a degree of accuracy that maybe clinicians can't replicate. So those narrow domains where an AI can do repetitive, monotonous tasks to minimize error. So diagnostics, planning radiotherapy in cancer patients, selecting appropriate chemotherapy for cancer patients because there's always new drugs coming onto the market. Another underspoken area is resource allocation. So how can we use AI and the data we're receiving from the health records that we're collecting to predict outcomes? So for example, in Boston, in the US, they've actually used natural language processing models into their healthcare record system. So they can actually predict which patients are likely to present at the hospital or which patients are actually likely to present with a serious infection. So if you can implement AI using the standards that a standards institute like BSI has created to develop these AI models, you can actually allocate resources to the areas where they're most needed. So to answer your second part of your question about the role of standards in creating that better future, I think resource allocation and equity is a big part of it. Because if you have a standard, you can, allocate those resources where they're needed.
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just not the narrative about AI that we often see on the news, is it? There's so many trust and ethical issues that we see. You're often lost in the noise of all these benefits that we are experiencing already. Tom, I want to come to you. Tom Cantillon is BSI's London Declaration Policy Manager. Now, we spoke briefly about London Declaration this morning, but let's fill in the gaps. And how do you see the London Declaration and that commitment of the standards bodies playing out and having a real impact on climate change?
Yeah, thanks, David. We kind of mentioned it in the first panel, but I'll just kind of give some context for those of you who are unfamiliar with the London Declaration. But it was a commitment that BSI created as part of the ISO General Assembly back in September 2021, and was really designed to think about how we can align the standard system with an equitable net zero transition. And as part of that, it has kind of two main operational components. So the first one is to ensure that all new and revised standards are aligned with climate science. And the second part is about enhancing the role that civil society plays in the standards development process. And the reason for that is that standards affect us all, climate change affects us all, and therefore everyone should be involved in the standards development process in order to ensure that the outcomes, i.e. the content of the standards themselves, reflect the needs and requirements of people now and throughout a variety of climate change scenarios. And Gemma, in your talk, I was really reflecting on a lot of your points around digital trust and the principles we can apply to enhance digital trust. And I think a lot of it can be applied in a standards development context as well, because it's about opening that black box and allowing more people in and valuing different kinds of knowledge and making sure they're translated. So I'd love to pick your brain on that a little bit later. In terms of what we're doing at BSI to realise the London Declaration, so Amanda Richardson, who is somewhere, is leading on ISO TMB's task force for the London Declaration Action Plan. So if you have any questions around international actions, particularly at ISO that are happening, Amanda's your person to speak to. And then, as David said, I lead on kind of the development and implementation of the National Action Plan. So I'll just give you two things we're doing and then a call to action, which I will also put at the end because I am very keen to actually call people to action. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're doing a climate impact assessment of our British standards. So we have some consultants in looking at all of our pure national standards, so not adoptions, just pure BS, PAS and FLEX, to understand whether and how they are contributing to SDG 13, climate action, and if they're not, how they could be enhanced in order to do that. So that will be delivering on kind of a sectoral basis. So we're looking at energy standards first, then construction built environment and transportation. And then from there, we're going to be really working with our national committees to understand how we can, think about incorporating climate considerations more holistically into a revision of that standard, and where necessary, get climate advisors to work with those committees to help them draft what an amendment or a new clause could look like. So that's a really exciting project that we're looking at. And then more procedurally, we're also thinking about, because I know it's come up as well, that these kinds of system transformation projects can't be add-ons. They have to be worked into processes as they stand. So we're also looking at things like, as and when new standards are being proposed, new national standards from now on as part of the planning and approval process, there's an obligation to kind of consider and document how you're responding to the climate adaptation and mitigation kind of requirements in your work. So, is your standard fit for purpose across a variety of warming scenarios? Is the objective of your standard associated with a high carbon sector or activity? How could you mitigate it in the design? So really thinking through how we work on that. So yeah, that's kind of how BSI is using the London Declaration, the wider standards community. It's not just us, it was endorsed by everyone at ISO, CENLEC, IEC, etc. How standards can be a force for good in an equitable net zero transition.
Excellent. Well, that equitable piece, something that's common right through all the comments I think that we've heard today. Let's throw it out to the audience. As I say, we've covered quite a lot of ground with this panel, from digital trust to climate change, but let's take a couple of questions. We have one there. Do we have another comment over here? Another one over here as well. You've got a microphone, so that means you're definitely first.
One of the things that was going through my head as I was listening to you speak is, in my domain, it wouldn't take very long to look at all the standards that sit in BSI, stick them into a system that can analyse them and explain them to people who are not grey and old like me, but to my children, and show them what it means to them. And then you could get them to give feedback to you as to how relevant they are to the way their lives are. You could create an index about what it means to maybe the 93% of people who don't come to these sort of events or and the like. And you could drive some social change and climate change and algorithmic change. And I was wondering, am I just thinking wrong, or do you think that's possible?
Well, I'm going to ask some of my BSI colleagues to step in, I think, on this one, but hold that thought. Let's take the second question, which is here in the middle.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name's Vince from the Chartered Quality Institute. Gemma, thank you very much for your talk. What I got out of that was a principles-based approach, as Tom said, to regulation, standards, and development has to be the way forward as the speed of change is so fast. I was interested, Nikita, in your bottom-up approach, and in the previous panel we had two standards writers. Somebody said there's standards butting up against each other, and in regard of the AI standard for healthcare, that could equally be applicable elsewhere. So my question is, with that bottom-up principles-based approach, is there a danger that we end up with a sort of vomit of standards and overlapping and intersecting, and it all becomes a little bit confusing? So therefore, do we need some governance over it so we've got sort of a controlling mind of how it all fits together?
Wow, okay. Vomit of standards is not the collective noun for standards. Let me just be clear on this. Might be now. Yeah, so Gemma, on that second point, yeah.
I think your questions are actually linked in many ways, and I could imagine, not being an expert in standards, I'm also a guest, as well as you mentioned, Kennedy. I can imagine this is probably a key concern a lot of the time is how do you make sure everything fits together well. I'm a sociologist now, I guess, and one of the really interesting concepts in sociology that I take a lot from, that I think is really powerful, is this idea of making the familiar strange. And this is the idea being that the role of sociologists is to describe a sector, a community, a thing, a social relation, and in describing it in a particular way to the people that know it well and people outside, or the people who know it well, you make what they find familiar strange, and it allows them to see the problems with it. And I think this idea of, well, first of all, the idea of chucking all your standards into a system and making them simple, I'm assuming you're referring to ChatGPT. I'd not recommend doing that, particularly because it's not necessarily very accurate. But the idea of finding ways of taking the standards and boiling them down into something that's a different kind of language, I think is not only just useful in terms of getting different kind of outputs and having that equity point, but in order to actually allow all of you to take a step back and be like, what is it we're actually doing here? What is this thing? And to kind of go to your question there, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, to kind of think about what level is this standard coming in at? Are we looking at society as a whole? Are we looking at this technology in and of itself? Are we looking at an institution within, where is it kind of coming in? And then you can start to look at how they intersect. So I think there's a job to be done around, stepping back and looking at systems. This is one of the reasons why one of my areas of research is political economy. People think I use these terms and I'm a Marxist, but it also just means a description of what are the politics and what are the economics of this thing. And I think we often don't do that when we're looking at stuff. So I'm trying to describe it in a way that you think, yeah, this is obvious that we're doing this. I think sometimes you describe it in a slightly different way and you think, hang on a second. A perfect example would be scientific publishing. You tell people, you pay twice for papers, and they're like, sorry, what? But everyone within scientific publishing is like, yeah, that's what you do in science. So there's this kind of there's power in being able to describe things different ways, and maybe it'd be useful for your mapping project as well.
I'm tempted to throw the question back into the audience because we've got a lot of people who are on a daily basis writing standards or involved in using standards, and whether you've thought about the use of AI in the work that you do. Because certainly, in my personal opinion, while the doors are closed, is that the process that we go through to write standards has not been transformed a lot since BSI started in 1901. It's a very human, intensive process where we bring people together, we find the right people, and we go out and we do lots of legwork to find people and to find the right people and bring them in. And then the consensus process takes time and it's complicated, and everybody says it takes a lot of doing. Is there a button that we should be pressing here that replaces that? Is it what can we do that's different? I mean, Kennedy, the net zero guidelines, you forced that through at a pace. I mean, the Kennedy, not just you, but the net zero guidelines were pushed through at a real pace. Did you see technology helping you there?
Absolutely. And I think if we think about the climate question, maybe I'll put it in a 30-year context, since when we started addressing that question across the world. When we thought about technology at that time, technology was quite expensive and it was quite limited. And also its sources or origins were quite limited. 30 years down the line, it's a very different context, which is the exact opposite. The pace of innovation is very, very fast. Some of it are calling exponential innovation. Technology is getting very, very cheap. But also, we are having technology being sort of innovated in very many different kinds of ways. So that really forces us to think, for example, the way we would have developed standards 30 years ago is very different from the way we develop standards. And just to add another layer to it, and I think building on the earlier point that I raised, countries have very different kind of contexts, depending on, for example, the structure of the economies. We have the industrialized countries, but we also have a huge part of the world, maybe 80%, where it's not as industrialized as such, but there's a huge sort of explosion of digital sort of services, so the digital component of the economy is growing really fast. So that raises the question then of how do we develop a set of standards which are at the international level quite coherent, but also quite flexible to fit the kinds of regional and domestic contexts that we have. So in terms of how we thought about, with Emily and colleagues addressing that question, was first and foremost the issue of alignment, looking at the Paris Agreement, which almost every country in the world has agreed to as a kind of set of guidelines and principles on how we should align climate action, but also looking at that logic, the bottom up, where each country submits its own climate plan. And if you think about that within, in terms of developing the guidelines, we developed a set of guidelines which have a common kind of framework, and for example, aligned with the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on making sure that standards are standards are credible and they are ambitious and they're fair, but also giving countries flexibility so that when they adopt these standards, they can domesticate them in ways that reflect the kind of national circumstances. So that's the way I think about these very rapid changes in technology and how they force us to think about the role of standards as a tool it can play in helping us to address some of the big questions that society faces, especially the climate question.
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to open it up. Anyone got any views on, particularly on that AI question, on the role of AI in the standards development process or in the use of standards, or any other question that you think will work for the panel? See more? We have Andrew down the front, and we have... The microphone's going in another direction. You be second. We have one at the there and then one here. Yeah. Please.
Hello. It's Matthew de Jong from Langley. This one's a question for Gemma. So much like the BSI are using technology to create accurate standards, with respect to your seemingly negative point of view of Twitter, technology is being used to democratize news and information, which is published by its users in like a town hall sort of environment, whereas the mainstream media, in contrast, are predominantly projecting their own agenda without much input from its readership. I wanted to know what you thought about that perspective.
It's interesting, this point around technology democratizing, because I think in some ways you're right, this idea that anyone can publish a YouTube video or anyone can tweet and so on and so forth, but it's kind of not really true. There are ways of gaming the systems to get more followers. There are ways of paying your way in to be able to be heard more, people with more privilege, monetarily, being white, many more things give you a bit more of a platform. So whilst there are huge issues with mainstream media platforms, as we know, I don't think it's right to say that technology allows for democratization without having a real understanding of how various different kind of privileges work in the real world. Lots of people just don't even have internet access, so they're not going to be able to tweet or put a video out, and they're not heard. Lots of people are not, their accounts get banned on these platforms, including Twitter. So I think that, though, there's something to be said about what can institutions learn from different kinds of platforms and how people use them and how people like to use them and what they demand of them. And I'd like to think that quite a lot of institutions, like BSI's institution, is trying to do that, is trying to go, well, how can we utilize power and the power that we have in different kind of ways? A big difference between media organizations and Twitter is a basic one is responsibility. Twitter and Facebook and all that cede editorial control. They say we're not editors, therefore we have no responsibility to what's on our platforms. Media organizations don't do that. They have editorial responsibility. So I think we have to sort of not have such a kind of one is better than the other, or one does this and one does that approach to how we think about technology platforms and traditional institutions, but rather look at what is it that one allows and has and is able to do, and what kind of power exists in both of them, and what do we like about both of them, what don't we like about both of them, and how can we find ways of merging. And at least with institutions, there's a little bit more, I think, shall we say, holding to account than a lot of the technology platforms that are out there. If you think about most of them are based in one country or two countries. Here in the UK, we don't have any say on how they're utilised. So whereas we do have that with our media outlets to a degree, even if it is just through regulation or through buying and stamping our feet, So I don't know. I think that it's just about trying to work out what the benefits are and what we really mean by democratization when we're thinking about media.
Zain and Nikita, I might just bring you in on those questions about the governance of technologies and the extent to which that impacts the decisions that you make about deploying technology and regulating, whether the extent to which the governance plays a role in decisions that you take.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I guess just circling back to the question previously as well about the vomit of standards. I guess I spoke previously about the great role standards can play, but always when there's a positive, there's often a journey to get there. And, we as government recognise how the process around standards can be really difficult as well. You spoke already about challenges around competing standards, competing SDOs, standards development organizations, and also we spoke about accessibility before to those standards as well. But in the AI kind of field, these standards are for businesses, but AI companies could be, someone operating out of their shed or garage. How are they going to know what standards are? How are they going to have the time to attend these standards development organizations? So this is a real problem that we recognize as government. And one thing that we're also trying to do in our approach is look at how we can reduce some of those barriers and how we can support this innovation and the standardization process. So one thing we've launched recently is the AI Standards Hub. If you're not signed up to it already, please do, aistandards.hub.org.uk. And so we're working with BSI, Alan Turing Institute, and our National Physical Laboratory to kind of do much more community outreach, provide, different stakeholder groups with increased accessibility to AI standardization. We have a tracker where they can look at what AI standards are relevant for them as well. Maybe not the same as the suggestion of having kids kind of review the tracker, which sounds amazing, by the way. But this is kind of an initiative that we're trying to do as government, working with our key partners to help reduce some of those barriers. But it is a challenge. It is standards. There is a need for kind of some modernization within the standardization process as well. But these are some of the things that we're trying to do as government to help reduce some of those barriers and also align standards with our wider governance approach. So we've just Department of Science, Innovation and Technology have just released our approach to AI regulation, the AI white paper. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it already, also look at that, add that to your list. But we've spoken about how standards is a complement to our regulatory approach as well. So it's really looking at more of a kind of a wider governance picture to the technologies. There's not going to be a one route of regulation. It's going to be a combination of different tools.
Yeah, thanks. And Zane?
Thank you. I'm not involved in the development of standards, but I can talk generally about implementation. And I think the UK is at a really interesting inflection point, or we could be a global leader in AI and regulation standards. And I think how we act in the next 5 to 10 years could influence that. So, for example, where I work in healthcare, there is a big potential compared to the EU for the UK to be that sandbox that we mentioned before for AI. But we're also fighting with how do we keep the general public safe and how do we make sure that the person starting their quirky startup in their garage or the multi-million-dollar tech company, how do we align standards across the board and internationally, especially in human-facing industries like healthcare. So I think it's important for safety, reliability, interoperability, not only in the UK, but hopefully across the world. And I do see great potential in the UK to do that, and BSI will be part of that as one of the biggest standards institutes in the world in implementing those that responsible AI standard.
Thanks. Andrea? Yes, it does.
Thank you. It's about AI, and this probably is going to make me sound really old, but anyway. Back when I was young, I was a science fiction fan. You may have heard of my favourite author, Isaac Asimov. Of course, and his 3 laws of robotics, which I'm told are totally out of date these days. But I wonder how out of date they really are. Not that long ago, earlier this year, Elon Musk and several other very well-known people called for a moratorium on the development of AI. Now, the cynical amongst us say that was because they wanted their own companies to catch up. But at the same time, I was reading about ChatGPT, which I've resisted the temptation to play with, and that you could ask it questions, and it would, if it didn't know the answer or couldn't find the answer, it would make one up. Now that I find incredibly worrying, really scary. We're already living in a world where you can change a photograph, change history even, and that sort of thing happening, I'm wondering if where we shouldn't start with standards and regulation is ethics and safety of AI. And are we doing any work in that space?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Do you want to talk about ethics and safety as a
yes,
building trust?
yes is the short answer. There are an abundance of people that work on ethics and AI, from academia to, I mean, a lot of companies have ethics people hired. A good friend of mine is an ethicist who works within a big advertising organisation that does the government advertising work. There is I agree with you that there's an argument to be made around starting with ethics and safety. I think the problem, though, with focusing on ethics and safety alone is you get exactly what you get with net zero. You get greenwashing, you get ethics washing. And I think that's why I sort of believe in kind of taking a more principles-based approach or values-based approach as opposed to starting from philosophy. And also because it's sometimes not very centered in the real. You can have ethicists that come in to work with organizations that have a brilliant philosophy PhD or have worked in ethics in companies and so on and so forth, but have absolutely no idea how things are used on the ground by the people that it's impacting. So yes, we do need to have it, but I don't think it's necessarily where we should necessarily only where we should start. There's a lot more to it. And to kind of your point on sci-fi, I mean, sci-fi is interesting. I'm doing a bit of research at the moment around sci-fi and bureaucracy and how bureaucracy is implemented in sci-fi and how that impacts the reader and how they feel about how they work. And I think the kind of point of that research is to show that the impact that sci-fi can have can be a very reflective one, and we see that within, companies are hiring science fiction writers to come in and write scenarios for them to try and help them understand the difficulties with their companies. My thesis is on that and is slightly critical of it, but I think it's an interesting point of utilising science fiction. The other side of it, though, is that we've openly seen many entrepreneurs cite sci-fi as the inspiration for what they've done, despite the fact in the sci-fi novel it was a dystopian, horrible technology. So I think that there's something to be learned by, exploring things through fictional senses and allowing for those imaginations and those thought experiments that allow us to think about things in different kind of ways. But for me, it's always about coming back to the material and the real and the experience of people on the ground, and seeing how they react to things, how they feel. A perfect example would be AI doctors. Babylon, I think it was. Not Babylon, sorry. What's the AI doctor company that was had all the controversy over COVID? I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, they were allowing people to change their doctor surgery to an app, basically. And the idea was you could see a doctor virtually. But what this did was change the whole dynamics of how the NHS worked, because it made people delist from their surgery, which is how the NHS allocates money, onto this digital app. And the majority of people on the app were young people who weren't unhealthy. So it meant that this surgery that was registered was getting loads of money, but not actually having to use it. And then local surgeries weren't. And what we saw was that there were some areas in London where people started protesting the use of this app because their surgery was getting defunded. And, who would have thought that there's people out on the street in some borough going, my surgery's not getting well funded, my GP surgery, understanding the economics of these things. It's only because it impacted them and they saw it in real life. So I think instead of starting from this, wouldn't it be great if we could all do this, and what are the ethics of us not being able to access things, we should be able to be virtual. We need to have this kind of citizen material approach alongside as well. I was a bit rambly, but hopefully that helps.
And we do have an AI management system standard coming out this year, which will help organisations implement a safe and trustworthy AI system. We got one more question at the back. Microphone's on its way. Another one at the front. While the microphone's on the way, Sophie, I might just ask you, how does the work that you do, how is the work that you do impacted by digitalization? I mean, do you see this as a force for good, or do you see this as a further barrier, a further divide in society?
I was just reconnecting my brain because I was learning so much about AI then. I was like, oh my God, this is fascinating. Yes, that's a very good question. So during the pandemic, obviously everyone moved online, and that was great for a lot of us. I personally suddenly took up talents I didn't realize I had, like baking cookies and going for a run. As you can probably see, I do one of those activities and not the other now. And what we saw with our students, because our organisation really blew up in the pandemic, we went from having 2 universities at Bristol and Durham in the start of 2020 to 50 by the end of 2020, just through organic growth. And so we were really interested in finding out actually how was working from home impacting our students, because we know that for a lot of the students on our membership database, they will be from working class homes, and so actually if they were staying in their student accommodation, great, but many of them were actually going back to where they came from, and usually they were small places, and so we did a working environment survey, and the title of it was Cold, Cramped and Cut Off, Why Working From Home Doesn't Work For All. And I've been seeing this really interesting trend with the employers we work with who are like, isn't this brilliant? We can now do online interviews, and we're democratizing access to these spaces that other people haven't been able to get to before, which is absolutely brilliant. But part of that conversation which is being missed out is the privilege of having a really lovely home to work in. And what I found really fascinating about the pandemic, which I'm not a sociologist, but loved sociology and kind of wish I did it, was the fact that humans have the ability to find social class markers in literally everything. And suddenly in the pandemic, it went from the office chat and whether or not you wore brown shoes, which was absolutely ridiculous, to whether or not you had a nice backdrop. And suddenly, if you had a nice picture in the background, that was a sort of marker of like, oh, they're a bit well... What books? So everyone suddenly got a bookshelf. And I didn't realise this was a sort of social marker point. And I was a trainee at a very big law firm at the time, making loads of faux pas. And I sat in front of my dirty washing, and then the partner had to have a word with me because it was such an important thing. Like, this is not professional. So that was fascinating. We thought, how does this affect our students? And so we just asked them. We just did a survey, and it's a learning from that, which is that it's amazing the kind of information you can get from your users when you just ask them how things are affecting them. We got about 700 responses over the course of 4 weeks, and this was really intense qualitative data. We had 79 different universities who were responding to it, and the results were really shocking. On the qualitative data point, which was the saddest point, was that students were reporting that they were sharing beds with their siblings again. Some were reporting chest pains from the damp, and they were saying that actually they didn't feel that they couldn't feel they could participate in university anymore, or actually in graduate recruitment interviews because of these issues. And I think the thing that is left out of the conversation on the digitalization point is dignity. And actually a huge part for working class individuals in the social mobility conversation is the psychological impact of being able to see yourself in certain spaces. And so if you're interviewing a big law firm or a big bank or an organisation like BSI, and you're sat in your council house and maybe you don't have a spare room, you're sort of on the kitchen, perched up there, or maybe you're on your bed, you're not psychologically in that space, and so you don't really feel like you belong, and that's when the imposter syndrome cut in. And we found, obviously, that 74% of our members said they didn't have good enough Wi-Fi to actually engage. We all know that it's not particularly groundbreaking or interesting. Well, it is interesting, but the thing that really affected me emotionally, and I actually cried reading this survey because it was devastating, was that 59% said that they refused to turn on their cameras for employers or lectures throughout the whole of the pandemic. And 61% felt judged for their backdrop. And the words that were coming through the qualitative data were ashamed, embarrassed. And that was, I think it was there was a period before Teams caught on and made those funky backgrounds that you could switch on now. So I think in the digitalization conversation, we need to get out of the habit of it's black and white, this is good or this is bad. And actually, if you're interviewing a candidate for a role, ask them whether they want to come in or whether they want to do it from home, because you don't know what that individual is dealing with at home. And it's not always necessarily a class thing. There are people who are wealthy, who have caring responsibilities, particularly also women. You know, you might have a child crawling all over you while you're trying to do an interview. So I think it's about having a nuanced approach and seeing the person that you're dealing with as an individual who has all these different components to them, as opposed to, brilliant, it's online, let's do it that way because it's easier.
Thanks for those insights. That's really interesting. Yeah. Question at the back, David.
Is this working? Yes. Here's a different dimension. I'm one of the elderly people, classed as a geriatric and a committee man. I have noticed, and it's very pertinent to what you're doing, is that the older generation, perhaps from 60 onwards, are suddenly isolated by some of the changes in technology. Thank you for agreeing. And I don't think organisations actually face up to this, you know, banks, whatever, and check with their users and the people who are vulnerable, do not have a smartphone, cannot manage Wi-Fi, whatever, do not have accessibility to it, and can't work with it. And I wonder if we need to do something that actually, you know, in effect has secret shoppers or whatever for organisations before they actually launch things and move things forward. And it's just something I passionately feel there's a need for, having suffered, or my partner suffered the last few days with struggling with a phone and whatever. So that's my question.
It's a good one. And we've got 2 more questions here as well. One there, and then Michelle at the front.
Thank you. Thank you. Ian Byrne, IBEX. I'd like to actually turn the one about how to improve trust in technology on its head and say, how do we reduce trust in fake technology? We particularly see that with climate change denial and the anti-vaxxing movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Michelle as well.
Counterpoint to my colleague who's concerned about the demographics. So 2 points, David. I think you said ask practitioners. So I'm using standards as a way where, yes, it can be considered a vomit of standards, but the benefit of that is, especially when you're dealing with international communities, for example, I knew that the BSI standard was the right one to use for a certain engagement, but I still had to read the 27 documents, and I did read every single one of them, as part of the due diligence. So if someone did say I was biased, I could say, but I've read this, this, and this, and for this application, this is the best standard for the outcome. On the other front in industry, what we're doing is looking at personas. So yes, we do appreciate that we're not always delivering to millennials. They're going to be a big consideration. And I think Dee Dee brought up the point, looking at the retiring population, the annuities are still a consideration in any profiling you're doing. So the end user isn't just one person who's, you know, completely computer literate, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to consider accessibility for different personalities, different personas, and different abilities. And that is starting to be appreciated within companies. And on your point about Twitter, I would encourage everyone, when we have our concerns about AI, is we all have the ability to just switch it off. And if everyone made a stand of being conscious, not complicit, we can affect the change by just saying, I'm not comfortable with that, I want to switch it off. Can you imagine if everyone in the UK just decided one day to switch off Twitter or Facebook or what have you? And that's how you can affect change.
Great. So people power and digital switch off, fake technology, age divide. We're covering a lot of ground. Does anybody want to pick up anything that stands out for you in those questions? Want to pick out?
Jump in, or I mean, I'm speaking a lot. Does anyone want to go first? I don't mind.
If I would just quickly pick up the point on reducing trust in fake technology. In a climate context, that comes up all the time, and I mean, it comes up a lot in terms of the solutionist mindset that creeps in around certain companies and what they will do in order to respond to the obligations of net zero, et cetera. You see it a lot in carbon markets and carbon dioxide removal and things like that. I think actually that's quite a critical space where standards can play a really key role in defining quality and kind of shedding light on what good looks like across a variety of scenarios. So, you know, things like the net zero guidelines, which Emily and Kennedy were working on, are a really critical component in kind of creating a common ground consensus on what good looks like in a different context. And I think you can extend that across a variety of things. And you're thinking about ICVCM, VCMI, when you're thinking about what a good claim looks like for the utilization of carbon credits and what the good quality carbon credits look like themselves. That kind of work is critical in order to reduce trust, because then it's more easily as a user to spot, insert expletive here in terms of what companies are doing, and also as a legislator to regulate that out as well, because standards have a critical role in shaping or kind of helping to shape what regulation can look like in this space also.
Great, thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Anything else want to come in, Kennedy?
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback on that point and maybe emphasize the role of standards as a public policy tool, especially in addressing some of the big problems that we have. I think and that sort of combines the issue of trust and the ethics, regulate how do we govern good technology and bad technology. And I think in terms of the bad technology, for example, mining crypto has had is having a very huge carbon footprint. But now if you combine it with AI, it's just like on steroids. And that's posing a very big challenge in that we hadn't thought that as a sort of a source of pollution. But regulators or public policymakers are struggling with that. Maybe a way could be to regulate that, clamp down on that. But there are also good solutions that are coming based on AI. Just to give an example is smart metering, which is increasing efficiency in electricity. But also, I've seen some examples where people are combining AI with modeling to come up with, for example, products on climate insurance, be it insuring against drought, etc., etc. So you have these kinds of very good solutions that we hadn't thought of before, out-of-the-box solutions that are driven by technology, but we also have very scary sort of scenarios. And so I think a kind of public policy that is agile and clamps down on the bad technology but incentivizes the good technology could be a way forward in terms of addressing that question.
Very good. Yeah, Gemma?
Yeah, come in with a slightly different point, but hopefully adds to your questions that you've asked. First of all, on the gentleman asking about more elderly people with technology, and you're saying you've been suffering over the past couple of days. Let me tell you, we suffer as well trying to help our elder relatives, with these technologies. I get phone calls from my mum like every other day. How do you copy and paste in WhatsApp? I think that, you're absolutely right. Like this idea of designing for us, who is we, there's multitudes in so many different ways. And kind of linking to the question the gentleman asked here about, I guess, how do you reduce trust in bad technology? I think we have to keep coming back to the question of like, what are the incentives at play and why do people feel the way they feel? So if it's an organization creating some app instead of a different kind of service that it used to be, really understanding why it is that they've done it, which is it's not normally accessibility, it's normally saving money. Proposing, okay, well, if it's about saving money, how can you save money without having to put people through a particular technology process? We don't tend to start with that question. We start with like, how do we make sure this one piece of technology can be used by absolutely everyone, which frankly is impossible. So coming back to that point of like, why are we doing this and how do we do it in a way that's more equitable is key. And to link to this point here, so anti-vaccine, you've talked a little bit about climate change, so let me talk a little bit about anti-vaccine. I studied science, I'm obviously not an anti-vaxxer. And I never understood, I didn't get it. I really didn't get it. I didn't understand why you wouldn't. And then I became pregnant during the pandemic before the COVID vaccine came out. And when it did, there was very little information for pregnant women. And it was really, really scary. It was really scary. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to read. The big, huge documents that came out, I can read scientific papers because I'm educated, and I still couldn't understand what was being said. In the early days, it got easier over time. And for the first time, I understood what it was like for a lot of people who are anti-vax, who are not, doing it out of trying to get lots of Instagram followers or whatever, but they're scared. They might have had bad experiences with the health system in the past. We know that Black women have huge issues around living after having a child, for instance, in the UK. Maternity deaths are so high. So there's reasons sometimes for people feeling like they're not being spoken to in particular ways. And just saying you're wrong and here's information, here's a standard, doesn't do anything. But instead it's about looking at what do these people trust. And for me, it was, well, other pregnant women who've gone and got the vaccine, are they okay? You know, and so as much as that's, I think we have to reframe kind of why people are not necessarily trusting. There are people, bad actors out there who are doing it for, frankly, monetary means, but then the people that end up trusting them don't realise that that's the reason they're doing it. They think it's because, oh, they get me. So I think we have to have a different approach to engaging with populations that are, for whatever reason, dissociated from mainstream scientific, whatever you want to call it, arguments, and work out what it means to gain their trust in a way that's you know, empathetic, frankly, and understands normally the systemic problems that have made them not trust things in the first place. But it's the same thing. It goes back to like, what are people feeling? What are their incentives? Why are people reacting in certain kind of ways? As opposed to looking at the facts. It doesn't really necessarily help us, just alienates.
We're going to take the last questions, and then we're going to come back to the group. Unless, Zane, you've got anything else to add at that point on that trust question again around you know, how do you get the user involved? How do you get the user to accept the technology?
Anything to add on the trust point?
I think what we'll do at the end, we might come back to you, and just to pick up this issue of interconnectivity, that the whole theme of the day was how do we all work together, and what solutions can we work towards. But let's have the last. If you've got a question, now's the time to ask it. And I can see one in the lights down there.
Yeah, so I have one, which was actually, David, what you were talking about. I mean, I've learned a lot more today about how people, planet, and digitalization are connected. But I just continuously have this feeling that we're solving one problem and creating another one in the other areas. So we're solving a planet problem, but creating a people problem. Or, you know, solving one problem and creating two more. So that's what I was, you know, if we know so much about how interconnected these things are, why is it that we're still not joining up the conversations enough? And what would be your one recommendation, which is, I think, kind of where you were going, David. So I'll now pass the mic.
Well said. Yeah, exactly. Well, I had two questions. The other question was, how do you cut and paste in WhatsApp? But you can probably talk to me later on about that. Talk me through it later. Who wants to go first on picking up this issue of interconnectivities? Are we creating another problem when we solve one? Is there a connectivity between these different topics that we've talked about today?
Take a stab on it first. I guess it's an incentive problem. Are the incentives to build good, sustainable systems, to build good green infrastructure, or to build a better digital infrastructure, or to build a better culture for your people and your organization? Are the incentive structures for all of those things aligned? I'm not sure they are. So if the way we're organizing our economies, if they're organized in a way where their structures, incentives are not aligned, how can we have an optimal outcome in all of those different areas? I'm not sure if anyone has anything to add on that.
I can build on, because that was similar to what I was going to say. I mean, you're saying, like, what's the one thing, you know, banish capitalism. No, but I think there's something to be said about the fact that there are these, like, it's not a silver bullet, but there's kind of a very obvious answer, which is there's a very, like, essential incentive that sometimes, a lot of the time, supersedes all of these points, which is making money, or saving money, or fitting into whatever system we have in here in the UK, at least in a sort of market economy. And if that's not considered really deeply in how you try and create incentives through standards, you're kind of fighting a losing battle. I was on a panel yesterday talking about, it was all about innovation in media, and they were saying everyone needs to have a good understanding of AI in order to work in media. And I was like, everyone needs to have a good understanding of how shareholders work in order to work in media, because you have to remember that you work for a company that's owned by someone else at the end of the day, and they have power over you. So I think that there's a level of, like, reckoning and kind of declaration and realism that we need to have about the other kind of forces that push people to make decisions in different kind of ways. And when we're creating standards, when we're creating rules, when we're creating, you know, whatever it is, taking that really seriously into account, as opposed to kind of I think sometimes it's like the elephant in the room, we kind of ignore it. Like, oh yeah, everyone cares about responsibility. It's like, well, yeah, maybe we do in the room, but ultimately going to walk out and go, how can I make sure I get a pay rise? Or how can I, like those are the sort of things that actually matter in people's day-to-day lives. And that's linked ultimately to the fact we live in a market economy. So I think that has to be a much stronger part of the discussion, and is the link ultimately between all of these points.
Tom, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, kind of building on the point around market economy incentives, I think another thing that happens, particularly picking up on a point that came up earlier between the inherent or perceived tension between the E and the S in ESG, I think sometimes it comes down to a metrics problem, because so much of my own personal view on this is that a lot of the sustainability agenda and why climate action has become so salient is because the units that we're trying to measure and respond to are a lot easier to respond to than things like enhancing people's dignity or ability to live a rich and fulfilling life. Like when you're dealing with units of carbon, parts per million concentrations in the atmosphere, it's very easy to respond to and govern to that, and therefore the metric becomes the target, and that becomes the thing that people want to do because then they can report on it and it allows them to show that they have made progress. Whereas other metrics, which are maybe less quantitative, qualitative targets around kind of well-being and things like that, don't enter the conversation because they're not as salient to decision makers, they're not as reportable, etc. So I think, acknowledging that and being more kind of upfront with sometimes you need to make decisions not because they're able to be reported on, but because it feels like the right thing to do for this group of people is an important first step in trying to bridge that gap. Because, going back to a climate perspective, there is no net zero transition without it being an inclusive net zero transition. Society won't let it. We see protests all the time whenever people try and just implement policy changes without thinking about the impacts of people on the ground. And also, if the whole idea about responding to climate change is to address harm and mitigate harm in the future, harm's happening right now. And if we're not addressing that harm that's happening right now and addressing the system that will continue to cause that, because we're locked in to a certain amount of harm going forward, then we're not having the proper conversations we need to be having. But yeah, I think fundamentally it comes back to that, what kind of metrics we value and why we value them.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Kennedy, that just transition is the interconnectedness, isn't it, between people, planet, and technology?
Absolutely. And I think that's a very critical question. I'll just give an example of that point that has been raised: to solve one problem, create another. There's a very big push to have electric vehicles, etc., which is very important in terms of dealing with emissions from vehicles. But the flip side of that is, to some degree, some of the critical minerals that are needed to drive that transition are actually exacerbating problems with child labor and conflict minerals, etc. So how do you then connect the two? For example, if you're developing standards on decarbonization, do you just look at one element of incentivizing EVs? Or do you also think about how you could look at the entire value chain, etc.? So that touches on the climate component, as you mentioned, which is what do we measure in terms of reducing emissions. But what is the impact on people as well in terms of that value chain? As you said, there are those who run the value chains, maybe for them the most important thing is the bottom line, but then do we think about the other dimensions or impacts? So I think in terms of standard setting, where we start from, or where we should start from, should be informed by that kind of idea where, of course, there's a benefit to developing standards that are very sectoral, but also I think there's a downside to that, and maybe stepping back and thinking about how could we sort of kind of connect the dots that way. I think it's something that cannot be solved sort of once and for all, because as we go along, many more kinds of challenges will come up, and that raises the issue of dynamism. Then how do we ensure that we periodically update our standards or our thinking behind how we develop standards as we go along?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Nikita, you have to have that overview. You can't separate them out as a regulator. Even in standards, digital standards?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I agree with kind of all the points the panel members have noted. I guess the way I kind of summarize it in my mind is, I guess ultimately it is a culture shift. Digitalization is only going to increase. It's not going to be just stay in one place. It's horizontal. It will cut across all sectors: education, health, etc. And I guess kind of from the approach that the government has taken on the AI white paper, you can kind of see that coming out in terms of empowering regulators to across different jurisdictions, healthcare, transport, energy, etc., to think about these principles of what we think good governance to AI is, and for regulators to feel empowered to create that risk framework in their jurisdictions as well. So I think it is a massive culture change. It's not something that can be looked in silo. It's going to affect all demographics, as we've already discussed as well. So I think, yeah, it's going to be, it's a big change for our society as we speak. I think we coin it as kind of the fourth industrial revolution. And I mean, yes, standards is a great tool to try and solve some of these problems. But it's, only effective if the processes work well. And, that also includes getting more diversity, more different thoughts into how we actually develop these standards as well. We can't just continue the way we've been doing business so far. So yeah, ultimately I do think it's a massive culture shift.
Yeah, thanks. And Sophie, to finish the interconnectedness of these topics.
No pressure. Final words.
Leave us with an inspirational finish.
Even though I brought up the initial question of the no solution about the E and the S tension, but I think it's a very astute question. I am very compelled to agree with the points that have been made about the fact that at the moment we are trying to optimize an existing system that is not working, as opposed to thinking really ambitiously about what the system should look like. And that's because we're quite, in the UK, we're quite conservative, not just because of our government, but, it's scary. Things have always been done the way they've been done. It is scary to think of a world in which actually when you're making a business decision, you're prioritizing what is the impact on the community, what is the impact on the environment, as well as the profit. And I think that's a big part of movements like B Corp, for example, and BSI, like thinking about things in a holistic way, actually is quite scary when you've been running a business for years and years and years that has first and foremost prioritized shareholders. So I think there is a psychological element to it as well, that we just need to be more ambitious. What that actually looks like, practically speaking, I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but I think it would strike me as strange if in the UK we didn't have some bright people who could put their heads together and think about this. I think the other point just to round this off with, because I think with conferences like this, you come away feeling so inspired and so energized, but also sometimes a bit exhausted, because you come away with all this vim to go and change the world. And actually, I think there is an element of, as humans, we are very complex, and every single person in this room will be looking at life through a different lens. So when we think about solving one issue, so electric vehicles, and there's the child slave labour, for certain people, they will be only focused on one thing and not actually thinking about the consequences of that. And I think just acknowledging first and foremost that as an individual, whilst you should care about every issue, realistically, you only have the capacity to really be an expert and really have expertise in a specific field. And so I think we need to get better as a society at being a bit more cohesive and actually realising who are the stakeholder groups who have the expertise. So if I'm making this really critical decision, how is that going to impact someone along the line? And it strikes me as that these groups are not talking to each other. And so actually, it comes back to interconnectivity, which is that actually we are failing to get stakeholders in a room to make these big decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the theme of the day, Gemma.
One very fun, just to build on your imagination and ambition point, because it's so pertinent. And there's a famous quote by a guy called Frederick Jameson, who said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And it's so pertinent and true. You watch that climate change film and it's like, oh, there's going to be an asteroid that ends the world and da-da-da-da. And we can all imagine that, but we can't imagine the idea of changing our systems of market economy. And I don't just mean it from a capitalism perspective, but I do think that there's a lot out there already, a lot of thinking already being done around how we change systems. And I think we all need to be a little bit more open-minded and not kind of, oh, anarchists, let's not listen to the anarchists. Actually, some anarchists have really interesting ideas. Let's see what they have to say. And it's the same for various different areas. So I think we all, there's a lot of thinking being done on these things already. And I would love to see more people kind of diving into some more areas that they wouldn't normally feel so comfortable in and seeing what they can learn. I think it'd be useful.
Brilliant. Join me, please, in thanking our panel, Zane, Tom, Nikita, Sophie, Kennedy, Gemma. Thank you so much.